The morning of January 12, 1888, was the warmest morning the Dakota country had seen in a month. After 3 weeks of 20 below, the air came up soft out of the south, the eaves began to drip before breakfast, and across 400 miles of prairie, children walked to school in their shirt sleeves, carrying their coats or leaving them home altogether, because the winter, for one morning, had let go. By nightfall, that one morning would have a price on it, and the price would be counted in children, caught in the open between their schools and their homes. The plains would remember the day by a name, and the name would not be about the wind or the cold or the snow. It would be about the schoolhouses. In one of them, a plank building with a tin stovepipe on the open flats above Kettle Creek, a 19-year-old teacher called the roll at 9 o'clock, and 13 children answered to 13 names. What follows is the next 20 hours, told the way she lived them, one decision at a time. Her name was Cora Fenn. She was in her second year of teaching, boarded through the week at the Holt farm a mile and a half east of the school, and was paid $25 a month, out of which she bought her own chalk. She was the whole staff of Kettle Creek School, its janitor, its bell, and its board of health, and she kept it the way her mother had taught her to keep anything, which was by counting it. Her mother had a saying about that, worn smooth as a thimble from use. Count what you have before you need it. So Cora Fenn counted. It was habit, not foresight, and she never afterward claimed otherwise. She knew that morning, without looking, that the coal box behind the stove stood a little under half full, because Thursday was the day it stood a little under half full. Friday was coal day. The district hauled it Fridays. The strangeness of the morning she noticed the way everyone noticed it, which is to say, with pleasure. Snow sliding off the roof in wet sheets, water dripping off the pump handle, the Holt horses restless in the yard when she left, stamping and swinging their heads, and Old Man Holt standing at the barn door looking at the southwest sky, saying nothing at all. She remembered that afterward. At the time, it was only an old man looking at the sky. Of the 13 children who came to Kettle Creek School that morning, 4 brought coats. The rest came swinging their dinner pails in their shirt sleeves, and little Essie Weber, who was 6, came in a thin gray dress and her brother's socks, because it was the first morning in weeks a small girl could walk a mile warm. It has to be understood what that warmth was, to understand everything that came after. It was not a thaw. It was the front edge of the coldest air of that winter, shoving the mild air up ahead of itself, the way a broom shoves water, and the whole of the northern plains stood in that mild push all morning, grateful, with its coat at home. The men who studied such things later called it the crudest trick the weather of that country ever played. The country itself, that morning, called it a nice day. School took up at 9. She called the roll the way she called it every morning, and it went the way it went every morning. Axel Holt, here. The Weber children, all 4. Here, 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 and here from Essie, who answered her name like a small door shutting. 13 names. 13 here. She marked them in the register in ink, ruled her date line, and wrote the date, January 12th, in the steady up-and-down hand the normal school had drilled into her. The room ran through its morning the way a schoolroom runs. Slates and sums for the little ones, geography for the middle bench. The 8th grade boys, both of them, at the long division of other people's wheat. The school clock on the wall ran 8 minutes fast, had run 8 minutes fast, since before Cora Fenn came to that county, and every child in the room could subtract 8 minutes faster than they could do any sum in the book. Nobody fixed it. It was not that kind of clock. At noon recess, the whole school went out bareheaded into the soft air, and the big boys got up a game of fox and geese in the wet snow, and the sun stood in a white sky like a lamp behind a sheet. It came from the northwest a little after 1 o'clock, and the children heard it before they saw it. A sound came across the flats like a train, except that it came from where no track ran, and it did not pass. Axel Holt, 12 years old, was carrying the water pail in from the well when he saw the horizon stand up. A wall of gray-black rolled toward the school, the full width of the world, boiling as it came, and he said afterward that it looked like the ground itself getting up off the ground. It struck the building all at once. The windows went white, then gray, then nearly dark, in the time it takes to say it. The temperature began to fall the way water falls off a table, and the snow it drove was not flakes at all, but a powder fine as flour, and the wind pushed that powder through the keyhole, through the stovepipe collar, through nail holes nobody knew the building had, in thin white threads that lay down on the floor and did not melt. What the depot instruments recorded that afternoon, the school felt in its bones. The soft south air of the morning was gone inside the hour, and the fall behind it did not stop at cold. It went down through cold and kept going, 10 degrees, then 20, then 30 and more before midnight. The fastest fall the oldest men in that country had ever stood outside in. The water pail Axel had carried in at 1 o'clock wore a skin of ice at the back of the room by 4. Inside, 13 children sat up in their rows and looked at the windows, and then, all together, the little ones looked at Cora Fenn. She was 19 years old, and she stood at the front of that room with the chalk still in her hand. And what she remembered thinking was not a prayer and not a plan. It was her mother's thimble-worn sentence, arriving on its own. Count what you have before you need it. She had half a box of coal, a water pail, 13 dinner pails, 4 coats, and 20 hours she did not yet know about. The first decision arrived within the half hour, and it arrived on 2 legs. Axel Holt stood up at his desk and said his father would be expecting him to bring the team in, and that he knew the road home blind, and that 1.5 miles was nothing, and every word of it was true. He was the biggest boy in the school, and steady, and he knew that road the way a boy knows the road between his bed and his supper. Cora Fenn put on her coat and scarf and told the room that nobody was to move from the stove, and stepped out into it herself once to know what she was deciding about. She kept one hand on the school wall and went along it as far as the corner, and looked out to where the well stood, 40 feet off, with the privy beyond it. There was no well. There was no privy. There was no ground and no sky, only a white that roared, and a cold coming into her scarf like water into a boot. She was gone from the room less than 2 minutes, and when she came back in, her eyebrows were iced white, and the scarf over her mouth had frozen into a plate. She stood with her back against the shut door and made the arithmetic out loud for nobody. 1.5 miles in that, with the light going. 40 feet had nearly turned her around. "Nobody goes," she said. "Nobody." Axel Holt was 12, and his father was on the other side of that wall of weather, and he stood by his desk with his jaw working. She did not argue with him, because you do not win an argument with a boy about his father. She gave him a commission instead. "You are my second," she told him. "The little ones are yours." And Axel Holt sat down slowly, a boy deputized into a man, and from that hour to morning he did not leave the little ones once. Then she counted the coal, this time on her knees, with the scuttle, piece by piece, while the room watched. With the stove drafted full and roaring, the box would be empty by 8 or 9 that night. The storm, by its sound, had no such schedule. She had heard the men at the Holt table talk about the blows of 81, 2 days and 3 nights, and about men who burned their furniture, then their granaries, then worse. So the stove went on rations before 3 o'clock, damped low, burning slow, asked to keep the room not warm, but alive. She moved the recitation bench square in front of it, and brought the little ones off their own benches and packed them onto it, closest to the iron, and hung the big roll-down map of the United States off its nails, and draped it behind them like a tent wall, so the heat that came off the stove would have to stay a while in that little country before it went to the ceiling. The 4 coats came off the 4 children who owned them, and went, without one word of objection that she ever recorded, onto the 4 smallest children in the school, and Essie Weber disappeared into a 12-year-old's coat, like a letter into an envelope. Supper was 13 dinner pails, most of them already half-eaten at noon, because no child saves food in warm weather. She gathered them all onto her desk and pooled them: heels of bread, cold bacon, 2 frozen apples she set to thaw on the stove ledge, a jar of molasses somebody's mother would want back, and she divided the whole of it into a supper for that evening and a breakfast for a morning she did not mention, and she made the division with everyone watching, because rations that are watched are rations that are trusted. Outside, the wind did not gust and did not rest. It leaned. Inside, the clock that ran 8 minutes fast said 4:30, which meant it was 20 past, which meant the dark was coming on. The building fought her once that evening, and it picked its moment the way trouble does. A little after full dark, a blast came down out of the northwest that made the whole frame stagger like a wagon dropping a wheel, and the stovepipe, where it ran up through the collar in the ceiling, jumped its joint. The upper length skewed sideways. Smoke came off the seam in a thin gray sheet and lay down along the ceiling boards, and 13 children began to cough in a room they could not leave. A stove you cannot vent is a stove you must put out, and a dead stove, that night, was its own kind of sentence. She did not put it out. She dragged the teacher's desk under the pipe, stood on it, and with her hands wrapped in a wool skirt out of the lost and found box, she seated the joint back onto itself, held it, and lashed the seam with the wire off the map roller, wound tight with a slate pencil for a windlass, while the metal cooked the wool brown under her fingers, and Axel Holt held the desk, and the whole school watched her, the way you watch the only bridge over a river. The pipe drew. The smoke thinned and lifted. She got down off the desk with the smell of scorched wool in the room, and her hands stinging, and, so the register says, gave out mental arithmetic, spoken in unison, for the next half hour, because 13 voices saying 7 times 8 is 56 cannot cough or cry or listen to the wind. What she feared after that was not the stove. It was sleep. The room, at rationed heat, stood somewhere above freezing of the bench, and below it in the corners, and cold children go quiet, and quiet children go to sleep. And in that kind of cold, sleep is a door that does not always open back. She needed them warm enough, together and awake, until either the coal or the night gave out, and she had no way to know which would quit first. So at 7 o'clock by the fast clock, Cora Fenn opened the register on her knee at the bench and called the roll. 13 names, in the order they stood on the page, and every child, warned once, answered to his name, loud enough to be heard over the wind. Axel Holt, here. The Weber children, 4 of them, one small door shutting after another. Here, 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 here. She called it again at 8. She called it every hour, all night, and between the callings she spent the school's other fuel, the kind that was not in the box. The times tables, chanted in the dark to save the lamp. Spelling matches, sitting down, mitten against mitten. 2 chapters of the Reader given out loud from memory, and given slow, the way you burn a big log. A hymn once, low, all of them together, and she never named the hymn afterward to anyone, and the children who grew old in that county never named it either, except to say that they each of them heard it all their lives. Between times she rotated them, bench to floor and floor to bench, so no child kept a cold corner long, and she kept the water pail on the stove ledge topped up with packed snow from the entry, because a room that cold is dry as a stovepipe, and thirst comes strange in winter and is not believed. The lamp got its own ration. The school owned 1 lamp, and perhaps 2 inches of kerosene in it, and a dark room full of children is a room where fear does its best work, so she neither burned it nor saved it whole. She lit it for the roll each hour, long enough for every child to see every other child answer, and blew it out after, and the room learned the rhythm of it the way a ward learns the nurse's lantern. Light meant names. Names meant everyone was still there. Dark only meant waiting for the names. The two eighth-grade boys got the entry. Powder was still threading in around the door and lying up in a slow dune across the boards. And twice an hour, by turns, one of them took the fire shovel out into that little cold room and moved the drift off the threshold and packed the cracks with it, snow against snow. Which sounds like foolishness, and is not, because packed snow seals better than bare plank. It was ugly, monotonous, freezing work, a few feet from the warm side of a door, and they did it all night, on schedule. And if you had asked either of those boys at midnight whether they were surviving a famous disaster, they would have told you they were on shovel duty. And each hour, the roll. 13 names, 13 answers. The register lay open on her knee, with the ink gone thick from cold. And past 10 o'clock she quit marking it, and only called it, but she never once skipped the calling. The coal box gave out at what the fast clock called 11:30. She had known since 3 that this hour was coming, and she had already chosen the order. The wood box itself went first, broken up small against the stove's appetite. Then the recitation bench, once the little ones were moved off it onto the desks pushed close, and the bench came apart hard under the iron poker and a boot heel, being district property and built to outlast everything but that night. Then 2 desks from the back row, the 2 with the cracked runners, which she split along their old wounds. She burned them slow, a piece at a time, the way she had burned the coal, and on the back page of the register, in pencil, because the ink had thickened past use, she wrote a list while it burned. 1 bench, 2 desks, back row, wood box. She wrote it the way a person writes a debt they intend to stand good for, and 30 years later that page was still in that county, and the list is still on it. A mile and a half east, the same night was being lived the other way around. Jens Holt, Axel's father, harnessed his team at 4 o'clock when the first blast struck, and got as far as his own gate before the whiteout took the road, the fences, and the sky, and a man who had freighted through 11 winters sat in a wagon he could not see the front of, listening to a wind that would kill his horses first, and him second, and turned back. He harnessed again at 7 with a lantern, and got no farther. So he did what that country did on such nights. He strung a rope from the house door to the barn so his own chores could not kill him, set the lamp in the east window where it burned until morning, and sat with it, a big man at a small table, while his wife kept the coffee hot for nobody, and neither of them said the word school out loud the whole night through. There were lamps in east windows all over that county that night. It was the only thing the parents of 13 children could put between themselves and the wind, and every one of them was burning for a building none of them could reach. The deep of that night came between 2 and 4, and it came for the smallest first. The cold outside had gone far below 0 and was still going, and the wind had not lifted once in 12 hours. Frost stood white on every nailhead on the inside of the north wall, 100 small, blind eyes, and the fire, fed on splinters of school furniture, gave a heat you had to lean toward to believe in. The children were past games and past chance. They sat packed along the desks under the map, like birds on a wire in a rain, and endured, which children can do longer than anyone believes, until they are made to. At the 3 o'clock roll, 12 names came back at her, and 1 did not. Essie Weber, 6 years old, deep in a borrowed coat, did not answer. Her brother had her by the shoulder before the teacher reached her, and she was not gone, she was going, drifted down under the cold to someplace slow and warm-feeling and bad. And Cora Fenn hauled her up out of it by the whole weight of her, opened her own coat, and buttoned the child inside it against her own warmth, and walked her, and talked to her, and made her answer. Not once, every few minutes for the rest of the night. Essie, here. Essie, here. 19 years old, and she owned nothing that night but a burned bench, a fast clock, and a list of names, and she called the names hour on hour. In a voice the older ones said afterward, "Never once let them hear anything in it but Tuesday." 13 names. 13 answers. It was the whole of her method, and the whole of her science, and it held. Toward 6, the wind changed its note. Not weaker at first, only different, the roar going hollow at its edges. And by 7, a gray came into the windows that was daylight arriving on its hands and knees. The snow had quit driving. What was left was cold, a still, enormous cold, the kind that follows such storms like a creditor, and she knew enough to know that the morning after is its own killer, and that the worst decision she could make at the end of a right night was a wrong 100 yards at dawn. So the last decision was the first one over again, and she made it the same way. Nobody goes. They fed the stove the last of the second desk, ate the breakfast she had held back out of the dinner pails, and waited for the country to come to them. The country came a little after 9, in the shape of horses. 4 fathers on 2 sleds, wrapped to the eyes, with heated stones under robes and a shovel standing up in each sled box like a mast. The drift against the door stood to the latch, and the men were into it before the teams had fully stopped, and what Axel Holt remembered was the sound of his father's voice coming through the door before the door could open, calling names, and the room answering. They had to shovel the entry from both sides, because the keyhole and the door frame had let in enough powder through the night to lay a drift inside the school. A small, white dune across the entry floor, smooth as poured sugar, in a building that had never once had its door open. The men came in on a wall of cold air and stopped, all 4, just past the threshold. The room they had come to dig out sat blinking at them from under a draped map of the United States, packed together, gray-faced, scorched-smelling, and alive. 13 for 13. One of the 4 was Jens Holt. He found his son on his feet with a small Weber child by the hand, on duty where the night had posted him. And whatever passed in that look between the man who had turned back twice and the boy who had asked twice to go, it settled the question of the road home for good, and neither of them ever raised it again. Cora Fenn stood up off the bench with the register in her hand, and did the last thing she did as the teacher of that night. She called the roll while the fathers carried and led the children out to the robes and the heated stones, name by name, checking each one off against a sled, and the men stood for it, every one of them, because there are procedures a room earns the right to keep. Nobody made a speech. Nebraska and Dakota were not speech-making countries. But Axel Holt's father, who had dug through 4 feet of drift to that door, took the shovel back over his shoulder, looked at the 19-year-old teacher his boy answered to, and touched his hat with 2 fingers. And she said afterward that she had been paid many times in her life, and never better. What that night had been, the county learned in pieces, and the pieces kept coming for weeks. The storm they came to call the Schoolhouse blizzard had crossed 4 states and territories in an afternoon, and it had caught the whole prairie in its shirt sleeves on the one warm morning of the winter, with the children in the open. The dead were counted for a month, and the counting passed 200, and the greater part of them were children, lost between a school and a home, some within a few hundred steps of a door they could not see. The schools that held mostly lived. The ones that scattered into it too many times did not. Kettle Creek read those stories aloud all February, in a county where 13 particular children were alive to hear them read. The county's own page in that ledger was written 11 miles at a time. A school south of the river had led out of the first slackening of the wind into what looked like a lull, and was only the storm drawing breath. And that district buried 2 of its own before February. Another, poorer in coal than Kettle Creek, burned every desk it owned and its teacher's trunk besides, and came out whole. Nobody in any of those buildings had been given different weather. They had only been given different mornings, different coal boxes, and different arithmetic. And the difference in the outcomes was the difference in the counting, plus the mercy of the draw. Cora Fenn never in her life claimed the credit of the difference, and the honest arithmetic backs her modesty part way. She had had a building that held its roof, half a box of coal to start from, furniture worth burning, and a storm that quit in one night. Had it blown through the second night, the desks would not have lasted it, and she knew that better than anyone who ever praised her, because she was the one who had done the counting. What she had brought to it was not luck. It was the counting itself, done before the need, and a roll called every hour in the dark until the dark gave up first. The school board met in February and replaced one bench and 2 desks, and against her penciled list in the register, somebody wrote 2 words and underlined them. Paid in full. The clock stayed 8 minutes fast. She taught in that county 9 more years, and there were children of those children, in time, who answered the roll to her. And if her eye rested a moment longer on a small one in a thin dress on a warm winter morning, no one in the room ever knew why. Essie Weber grew up in that county, married there, and kept house 4 miles from the school she nearly slept through. When she was an old woman, a granddaughter asked her once what she remembered of the great blizzard, expecting wind, and got instead a small shrug and one sentence the family kept. Somebody kept saying my name, she said, and I kept answering, and then it was morning. And every 12th of January for the rest of her life, wherever she was, she took down whatever book was nearest at 9 o'clock in the morning, and read down a page with her lips moving, 13 lines worth, and shut it again. Count what you have before you need it, her mother had said, over a thimble, years before the wind ever thought of her. She had counted. It had been enough, by the width of one night, and she never once mistook that width for anything owed to her. The prairie kept its own ledger of that day, and it is a hard page, and this story sits on the merciful corner of it. But it is worth knowing what mercy was made of in the places where it held. It was made of coal, counted at 9 in the morning, food pooled where every eye could see it, furniture turned into hours, and a voice, 19 years old, calling 13 names over the wind until the wind quit first. Courage on the plains was seldom loud. Mostly it kept a list, and worked down the list, and called the roll. Now, Cora Fenn is ours, and you will not find Kettle Creek School in any county record. But the day is not ours, and the day deserves its due. On January 12, 1888, after a strangely warm morning that pulled the whole prairie outdoors in light clothes, a cold front crossed Dakota Territory, Nebraska, Minnesota, and Iowa in hours, with winds men measured against locomotives, and a temperature fall of 40 degrees and more before midnight. The count of the dead passed 200, and a great share of them were children caught between school and home, which is why the Plains named it the Schoolhouse blizzard, and remember it also as the Children's Blizzard. The teachers were real, and some of their names are kept. Minnie Freeman led her pupils, roped together, through the storm to a farmhouse, and brought everyone alive. Seymour Dopp kept 17 children overnight in his school, and burned his stockpiled wood until morning. Lois Royce tried for a boarding house 200 yards away, and lost 3 children in the whiteout within call of its door. Etta Shattuck lived 3 days in a haystack and did not, in the end, survive her rescue. The teacher in the story is imagined. The day, the choices, and the children are not.